Hello, and welcome to the Critical Path Institute podcast. Our goal for this podcast is to connect the dots among our core competencies in regulatory science, biomarkers, data management and standards, clinical outcome assessments, and modeling and analytics, and how we accelerate drug development. CPath created this podcast for researchers, clinicians, and industry and regulatory professionals with the hope that these conversations and the resources we share will advance your efforts and partnerships to improve global health.
Please note that guest positions, organizations, and affiliations may be subject to change since the time of their recording. All introductions were accurate at the time of production.
Hello and welcome to eCOA Conversations, a podcast brought to you by the Critical Path Institute's eCOA Consortium. My name's Scottie Kern from the Critical Path Institute, or CPath for short, and I have the privilege of leading a conversation with some true experts in the field today. Today's conversation will be exploring the opportunities and challenges to the adoption of sensor-based digital health technology in clinical research. Now, our expert panel is drawn from the eCOA Consortium membership, and each of them are genuine thought leaders in this space. And we are blessed today to have Dr. Elena Izmailova, Chief Scientific Officer at Koneksa Health, Dr. Christine Guar, Chief Scientific Officer again at Actigraph, and Mark Matson, who's the Managing Partner of Patient Cloud at Medidata. So a very warm welcome to you all, and I'd like to let the audience learn a little bit more about you to start off. So I'll come to you first, Elena. Can you tell me, how did you end up in this DHT space?
Hello, everyone. I ended up in the digital space through somewhat unusual route. By background, I'm a biologist. I hold a PhD degree in biology. And prior to going into the digital space, I spent 15 years in the biopharma R&D. And I did a lot of work in bioanalysis. For those of you who may not be familiar with the term, I led the group that developed biomarker assays. And at some point in my career, and many of you may be familiar with this moment when you feel like it's getting too comfortable. I know a lot of stuff, everything looks familiar. One may look for a new challenge, and I found this challenge in digital because the promises of digital technologies or wearables that people call them sometimes were fantastic. It was not like anything ever heard of. And I wanted to learn and I wanted to grow. That's how I ended up in digital. First, I worked on the biopharmaceutical side, putting wearables or DHTs in clinical trials. And then I wanted to learn more and understand better what's happening actually where DHTs are being designed and implemented in clinical trials, and I joined Koneksa Health, and a move I don't regret.
That's good news. That's really good news to hear. Thank you, Elena. So, Christine, tell us your story.
Yeah, thanks, Scottie. I am different from Elena. Actually, I started my research career pretty much just in massive digital data. My PhD was electrophysiology, in basically trying to figure out how the cerebellum worked at Stanford University. So that's kind of where we were collecting and processing a lot of time series, right, from the electrodes. And then I moved into more of a human research using functional imaging and EEG, that type of stuff. So always passionate and trying to figure out how we can get more precise in measuring the human brain function when I was doing my academic work, and also behavior. And then I joined the industry first at Biogen, where they wanted to have someone to come and try to innovate the way we assess neurological conditions using digital, right? This is sort of what we're talking about. And I remember I came in and I was very, very new to clinical research or pharma research. And I was like, really? You guys have not been doing this? Really? You're still relying on subjective, clinician and patient reported outcome, and you're not totally like using technology to help assessing patients' condition. And so that was like a big learning curve, but also make me realize the gaps we have with regulated trials in some way, right? So that's kind of how I started really into this particular space, digital health technology in regulated clinical trials. And then I took the chief scientific officer role at Actigraph about 4 years ago, because I think in the vendor space, this actually gave me more visibility to help moving the field forward together.
No, lovely. Thank you for sharing, Christine. Mark, what's your journey to where we are today?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, thanks for inviting me. This is exciting. So yeah, this is my 30th year in drug development. So I'm a molecular biologist and spent about half of that time on the sponsor side at large and biotech pharma. And then the other half on the provider side. And about 6 years ago, I joined the executive team at a company called MC10, which was a 12-year-old startup, a bit of an oxymoron, devoted to the development of digital health technologies. We had the BioStamp, which was a skin-worn wearable patch that could be placed anywhere on the body to capture physiology. And then 4 years ago, MC10 was acquired by Medidata Solutions, and we're now dedicated to scaling this type of operation across all of clinical research. It's been an interesting road over the past 30 years, and I think the next 30 years are going to be much different. We haven't seen many changes in the past 30, but I think the next 30 are going to be much different if we look back at that point.
Thank you so much, everyone, for giving us a little bit about you. So let's dive in. Can I ask you, Elena, I'll come to you first, if I may. How would you assess where we are today with sensor-based DHT adoption in clinical trials?
It's a really interesting question, Scottie, and I'm going to draw parallels with bioanalysis field, because when I started working on bioanalysis in early 2000, it was highly reminiscent of what is happening with digital technologies. And I would say the field is getting mature. We have started doing real stuff, putting DHTs into clinical trials with really defined purposes for drug development, not just pilot experiments, feasibility, and exploration. So people get a good understanding of what it would take to implement the technology, and what results to expect. They are becoming more familiar with the structure of the data, but where we haven't gotten to the point of bioanalysis, where these services, if I may say so, are not a commodity that everyone knows, it's familiar, it's included in every study protocol, because we have not gotten to the point that biopharma sponsors fully grasp the benefits of having digital health technologies in clinical trials, and it becomes a default option for them. With biomarker assays is very much so, and it took 10, 15 years to get there. What is the main driver would be your next logical question to get to that point. Precedence of regulatory approval where the data has been used.
I definitely agree with Elena on that. We see a lot of interest growing, but it is still a very small percentage of the trials and biopharma teams that are out there. Just like Elena said, in my view, that every trial in the future should include sensor-based digital health technology to help some aspect of the protocol. But right now, what we see is that people still perceive this is a new thing. I would say that the sort of the innovator mindset people in the pharma company are actively working, and we are looking at some very interesting use case now being presented, based on the data collected in the last 3 to 5 years. But there are definitely still a lot of resistance and unfamiliarity from the biopharma sponsors with this.
Yeah, and building off of what Christine said, I see the education level, the familiarity level increasing across all different aspects or personas at the sponsors. So we often will have discussions with the regulatory people or the medical people, but also with the clinical operations people who need to manage the studies, the data. And each one of these groups has a different level of familiarity, and it really takes all of them to kind of be on that innovator, as Christine said, that innovator mindset, to really implement and get the full value out of this. If any one of those groups is reluctant or isn't fully in, it could cause some issues. But I definitely see that people are much more familiar with the language, with the use cases, and with the data analysis. And I think the AI promise is helping push that, because a lot of these are large data sets, and we rely on AI ML to do a lot of the analysis. So I think people recognizing the power of that technology has helped us move forward a bit.
One of the challenges that digital field is experiencing, unlike bioanalysis field, people with the right technical background are not easily found in the pharma R&D. For instance, in the bioanalysis field, people who wanted to develop their career and dedicate their time to developing assays can be easily found in pharma R&D, because these are bench scientists and they've been trained to do bench research and develop laboratory methods. In the case of digital, biomedical engineers, device engineers are not somebody who would start their career in pharma. It's changing. I see on the sponsor side that many companies hire people with data science background, biomedical engineers, like the example that Christine gave us of her own career. It's changing, but it takes higher level of effort to educate and to bring the understanding of digital technologies, of the data structures, of key elements of data collection on the sponsor side. It's just more work, and it's probably going to take a little bit longer.
Absolutely. I think this gap between the technical bioengineer, data science sort of expertise versus the clinical trial and regulatory biostatistic in some way, clinical trial space is a major challenge. And, not only, like Elena said, that there is a lack of technical expertise a lot of times in the biopharma space, even though we now see more with the bigger pharma, but mid-size, small companies are not going to invest in kind of resources. On the flip side, I also think that, you need the data scientist and engineer also understanding what are the clinical problem we're trying to tackle as well. So like, how do we make sure this multidisciplinary expertise and collaborations are in place is going to be key to really make the massive data that we're collecting useful and making concrete impact, right, in our clinical trial space.
Yeah, so Scottie, I'm going to move us along, I think, to your role in what could help position all of us for greater success here. A pre-collaborative or pre-competitive collaborative environment for pharma companies to understand this space better, to create a place for technologists and biologists to come together to solve problems. I mean, Christine and I were at an industry meeting a couple of years ago, and there was a large pharma talking about how they use the iPhone in the left pocket to characterize Parkinson's disease. And then the next presenter, another large pharma, got up and talked about how they use the Android in the right pocket to look at Parkinson's disease. So it was really like, well, how do we as a community, as an industry, bring these approaches together so that we're all advancing the same ideas for the same therapies? And I see CPATH, eCOA Consortium, folks that sit outside but provide structure, provide consultancy, bring people like us together to have these kind of conversations, build these frameworks in advance so that we have an opportunity to move it forward instead of kind of 2 step forwards and 1 step back all the time.
Now, that's a great suggestion, Mark. If only I thought of that previously. You're absolutely right that there is clearly a role for pre-competitive collaboration. I'd like to probably come back to that a bit more. The commoditization piece, Elena, of it becoming something that just people see as default, Christine, to your point as well. Should we not be at a space in the nearer term where this is something that is just, it has to happen? ePro and eCOA is kind of still not quite there, I think, but is very often, yes, we're doing that because we have to capture the patient's perspective in a fairly static manner that something like a PRO does do. So how do we get to that commoditized state?
I think the path for ePro and eCOA in general, and I'm talking here on about survey-based eCOA that is very much a commodity, was easier because technically it was easier to grasp. It's the same questionnaire, it's just displayed digitally, and the benefits of contemporaneous data, timestamps, and the ability to influence the completion rate were very clear. It was not without hurdles, but I was able to describe what needed to happen in the matter of a few seconds. If we move to DHT, the process is more complex. Moving from subjective to objective data with a lot of technical background, such as sensors, data processing algorithms, fairly complex ways of analyzing the data, and even more complex of interpreting the data. This is what needs to happen, and it understandably takes longer because going back to the ePro example, the instrument stayed the same. The validation properties, the psychometric properties of instruments didn't change between paper and electronic as long as the migration was completed properly. But when we talk about sensor-generated data, it's a completely different mindset, and changing mindset takes time.
I think the complexity is definitely a big challenge. And again, it has to do with expertise that we need for different components are not necessarily speaking the same language. And I think the sort of what we need from evidence generation for DHT, for regulator to accept it, is not exactly mapping to like how they would approve eCOA or PRO and stuff like that, right? And that is in some way unclear and confusing. And in the meantime, like I said, I came from academia, and we know there are many academic researchers familiar with digital and they want to help, but the lack of understanding of what pharma need from evidence generation, regulator acceptance, means that they're generating data that they think is helpful, correlation with digital, with something else, but it's not that critical piece that can actually move us forward. So I think some of those sort of way for us to bring the community together is probably necessary or helpful to help us accelerating it. And then also maybe just comment on what, I still have some other thought. Commenting on what Elena said, it takes time, right? Like a clinical validation takes time. You need to monitor patient for months and year, right? Talking about Parkinson's disease to validate it, convince people. And that is very, very rate limiting. And I think Elena talked about in the first segment where I do believe that unfortunately we kind of have to have some successful use cases to help convincing other majority mainstream, and they are happening. But I definitely would like to have more, let's say, collaboration, communication, and really we need a high-level leadership buy-in from a biopharma sponsor to invest, because we need to collect data. That is the requirement for us to generating some of those evidence, right? Yeah. All right, I'm done.
Right, and that was where I was going to go. That's where I was going to go, because I think we need to change the mindset of pharma in general, or at least in this regard, because we have this decision paralysis. We go back and forth. What are we going to collect? Why? What kind of data do we already have? Will the regulators accept it if we collect it? If we collect it and we find something that we don't understand, how is that going to impact us? Like, there's all these back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And like Christine just said, this idea of use cases. Well, to me, I think we need to collect the data and let the data drive us or lead us where we need to go. Because without the data, it's really hard for us to come up with these use cases, because we have a hypothesis and we collect data, and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But what we need is a more comprehensive way to collect data across either all placebo groups so that we have normative ranges and understand what disease processes look like just from, through the lens of these sensor-based technologies, or just in every clinical protocol, collect some level of data and have the ability to pool that across multiple, either companies or disease areas, so that we understand this better. Because right now the use cases are limited by the companies who are willing to try, willing to collect the data, have a hypothesis, have that hypothesis be proven correct and have the data to support it, and then have a regulatory conversation. To me, that's a really muddied area. I'd rather just have us all collect the data and then have the data lead us. I mean, the first time we collected data for cholesterol in the first patient and it said 90, did we have any idea if 90 was good or bad? I mean, it took enough data so that we can understand normative ranges and then use that in coordination with other parameters to really understand health or disease. And we just don't have that yet. And we need a better, more willing community to collect this type of data so that the data can lead us where we need to go.
Yeah, Mark, you speak to exactly, well, I guess we're echoing to each other, right? I mean, data is definitely something that I think about all the time. For me, the power of sensor-based DHT is that it is going to be fundamentally changing the kind of data we have in clinical trials and lead to our ability to leverage things like AI, large complex models to tell us and help us accelerating clinical trials. But you have to start with good data, right? Like right now we see companies and biopharma are investing a lot with AI, because it is a bit of a hype right now, even for a good reason. But what kind of data are we starting with to apply AI to, right? Where we see AI had made a massive impact, for example, weather forecasting, hurricane forecast. I don't know where you guys, like our company is in Panhandle, so we watch hurricane model all the time. And see that the model is so powerful this year where there was a couple storms that you cannot even see that on radar or satellite, right? Like the cloud hasn't even formed, the precipitation is not even in there. The model is already predicting there's going to be a hurricane, a massive storm forming in the next, 24, 48 hours. But think about what data had fed into that model, right? Like not 100, but tens of years, very fine detailed physics about atmosphere, temperature, and humidity, right? That help us to get that precision and certainty. And look at what we currently are trying to apply AI to: intermittent data, again, subjective reporting and stuff like that. So for me, fundamentally, for us to even think about AI, you have to start collecting good data. And for me, sensor DHT help you transform that data resolution we have in clinical trials.
There's always this, we don't want to collect data that we don't know what it's going to say. There's risk to collecting more data. There's cost to collecting more data. And so there's a tension between collecting data from these technologies in a clinical program and the data, not being well understood, well characterized, and well explained to the regulators. So we have to figure out a way to overcome that tension and make it much more cyclic and create a feedback loop rather than, a tension, have them play off each other.
I agree with everything that Christine and Mark said, and I would like to add a little bit again, comparing digital with bioanalysis field, because I believe if we fully understand challenges where they are coming from, we have a higher chance to overcome them. For instance, collecting data with biomarker assays is a lot easier with DHTs for very simple reasons that you can run the analysis on archival biospecimens. With DHTs, it requires prospective data collection. Whether it's a clinical trial, whether it is a validation study, once we move past the verification step of the sensor and we go into analytical validation of the algorithm, it requires prospective data collection from human subjects. For biomarker assays, analytical validation can be done with archival specimens, and it's much lower cost. And I'm putting my old pharma hat, and I see that it's easier to put something in a clinical trial with potentially lower cost. We will just collect, it's a cost of sample collection and sample storage until we are ready, rather than, yes, we have to get the devices, we have to have software ready, and we need to have everything ready when we're ready to launch a study. It's a different hurdle. It's not insurmountable hurdle, but again, from the perspective of the pharma sponsors, where there are many ideas for every single study and they compete for somewhat limited budget, for DHTs, it requires better articulation of benefits, why the data needs to be collected.
Yeah, and I think you're hitting on something that, again, is a change that we can exploit or that we have to be mindful of so we can exploit, which is, for a long time, we looked at cellular effects. We look at tissue effects, biopsies, samples, blood samples. We look at organ function, hepatic function, renal function. We're looking at all these things in a sub-organism state. Well, these DHTs are looking at the whole organism. And so we are not, how have we done that classically? Through a clinical outcome assessment, whether it's clinician-based, patient-based, caregiver-based, but it's been an observational, I'm going to look and see. And we have not always looked at the organism with the same degree of scrutiny or even importance as, are we shrinking the tumor or are we affecting the blood? So this, again, is a change in mindset for the industry to now look at the organism and say, this therapy is helping the tumor, but it's also affecting the person. And we can measure that. We can ask questions about that, which is usually asking a question about how the patient feels, sometimes about how they function, but how a patient functions isn't as easy to comprehend. And there's a lot of bias or kind of measurement issues with that patient to patient, investigator to investigator. So this measurement of the organism, I think, is relatively new. And again, back to the fact we don't have normative ranges on what a sleep pattern looks like in a particular disease or just in healthy, normal people. If somebody stays up late to watch the Super Bowl the next morning, they may feel tired, but great because their team won. So if you ask them a question about how they feel about their sleep, and you look at their sleep performance through a DHT, these things are not going to measure up, or they're not going to correlate. But in the end, the connection of those two things is what we need to be measuring.
In terms of what facilitates progress, and one thing I'm always very conscious of, and this is something that I've been in the eCOA space for a long time, but one of the things that was always kind of not a concern or something I was aware of is it was almost a vendor-defined industry. A gap was identified and then things moved into it, and it became recognised that it was really the only right way or the best way to get a true snapshot of what the trial participant is experiencing. And listening to you all speak, I'm thinking about what needs to happen to move things forward. So let me ask you about something you touched on, Elena, and yourself as well, Christine, the regulatory landscape today. It looks to facilitate. We're fortunate at CPATH to have an excellent relationship with the FDA, and there is a real spirit of collaboration and a need to take us forward there. But what do you see in terms of the landscape today and how it might need to evolve to support these things you're talking about that need to happen, really, to make sensor-based DHTs more integral to clinical research?
We need data interpretation, and show tangible how these tools can help drug development. Usually people point fingers at the regulators, that regulatory guidance documents are not clear, regulators are not specific enough, and I will defend here the regulators because they transact based on what empirical evidence exists. They don't create guidance and regulations out of thin air. I personally know many scientists who work at the regulatory agency. They're excellent scientists. They're very well trained, and part of their training to transact on data. Until we have data, it will be very difficult to develop, and we shouldn't be expecting regulators coming with something unclear based on what. We have very robust guidance given where we are in the field from both EMA and FDA on digital technologies use in clinical trials, but in the absence of some public information of what data is available, how the sponsors are using it, and how these data can be used in drug approval, it's very difficult to advance the field. And I know I'm sounding like a broken record. I go to the previous field of bioanalysis, from which I draw a lot of parallels. A lot of what drove the acceptance of biomarker assays in clinical research was a grassroots movement. It was not the regulators. The regulators were open. They adopted the idea, but the concept of fit for purpose assay validation came from American Association of Pharmaceutical Science that developed the framework, proposed it, people adopted, generated data, and they brought it to the consideration of the regulators. And that's how the bioanalytical guidance and biomarker assay guidance emerged.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I felt that our regulators are really doing, a thankless job. They try to do the best thing, right, for the patients, and they need to have certain bar of acceptance, but that should not be perceived as a barrier to the acceptance of some of these new things. I agree with Elena, like in my experience dealing with the regulator at FDA and EMA, I think they are incredibly open to the discussion of DHT. We recently had an engagement with the CEDAR division at the FDA about some of the new development we're making, and we had 50 people from FDA, from various departments, right, on the call, because they are all actually very much interested in understanding how they can move this field forward. But just like Alina said, the industry need to bring them the data and evidence to show and make the argument. And they cannot come up with a rule in the vacuum. We need to kind of figure out how to work on this solution as an industry and help things moving forward.
Yeah, so, and I think that also comes back to the disconnect between technology and science. And I'm not convinced that there are enough technologists at EMA and FDA that can help drive some of the policies on data collection, algorithm development, what's acceptable AI, ML models that produce these metrics. I mean, this is to some extent a kind of a black box, which FDA is always going to resist. We don't know exactly, how the algorithm, or we've used MI tools to create the algorithm based on this data set. But these things by design and by implication are, to Christine's earlier point about the weather, right? That's using data that we don't perceive to create insights that we can perceive. And so we need to have faith in that. And there's, again, a disconnect between the technologists and the biologists and the regulators that, that these tools and these data sets that we train the tools on are valid in these populations and that we use these as an approach. So I'd love to see more technologists infused into the conversation, on the regulatory side to drive that there, because I think these questions persist.
And I think that comes back to what you mentioned earlier, Mark, about pre-competitive collaborations seem to be where we are going to have the success we need. And continually framing it as not just something that's a good idea, it's necessary, right? It's something that really needs to be happening as opposed to being elective. And we talk about that a lot within the eCOA consortium, and as you know, but I'm conscious that it's been great to listen to the discussion, but I'd like to get each of you to tell me what you see happening in like the next 1, 3, 5 years. Just briefly, kind of like what you genuinely see happening as opposed to what you want to see happening. That's a bit different thing. So Mark, that's where you've been.
Yeah.
You're hot on the mic right now. Go for it.
Yeah, sure. What I'm seeing today and what I'm seeing in the near future is the consolidation of a lot of data into one place. We can't train AI/ML models on no data, but it's also important to have the data together. So classically in pharma, we've collected the lab data and it sits in its own warehouse on the central lab side. And at the end of the study, we take it and we, fuse it with the rest of the databases from that trial. And then we do our, analysis on it. Well, by bringing those data in from the beginning and collecting the lab data alongside the eCOA data, alongside the health record data, alongside the imaging data, alongside these sensor technologies, we're going to be able to have algorithms help drive efficiencies, drive insights, clinical insights, whether they be safety, efficacy, just really bringing all of those data together up front rather than waiting to the end. Is a trend that we see starting right now. And it makes a lot of sense because, again, AI tools thrive and can learn better with more data. And then I think the acceleration of the education, understanding, and infusion of these into clinical research will continue. And it will be a bit of, again, a positive feedback loop. We do a little bit in Parkinson's, and then somebody else uses that to do a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more. And pretty soon we have, a snowball of use cases and opportunities, and that's going to happen and accelerate. It takes a little bit just to get going, and then for everyone to build on that little bit and gain confidence around it. I think that's going to also accelerate over the next 3 to 5 years, so that all of these data that we're collecting can reinforce the insights we're getting from those, rather than waiting to end of studies all the time to do the analysis.
Yeah, it's a great question, and Scottie, I want maybe we put a time in our calendar in next year, 3 years, 5 years, and re-listen to this podcast and see if we were right.
It's a date.
So, so if I were to read into my crystal ball, and I think realistically next year is probably a bit incremental. I think we will see a bit more use, but I think it will be building on slowly, right, on the things that we've been doing for the last few years. In 3 years, though, I think we'll see several, let's say 10, maybe a handful, maybe 20 use cases that are concretely with regulatory endorsement have supported either decision-making in the pivotal trial or label claims. I think 3 years, we're going to see some of these very concrete examples. And I think in 5 years, I want to see, and I think I will see that the use adoption rate of DHT will double at least, and maybe triple.
My prediction is that within a year, we will continue seeing a trend that biopharma sponsors understand benefits of DHT implementation enough to understand which use cases for their specific drug development program require DHT versus nice to have. The second trend in 3 years, and I'm a little bit less optimistic than Christine, with this trend continuing, I would say we will have more data collection for specific purposes of drug development, for internal decision making by biopharma, like proof of concept studies where these tools can facilitate go, no go decision. And within 5 years, I predict that we will have several examples of drug approvals based on DHT-derived endpoints.
And that is what I'd love to see, that last one. But, let's hope we realise on that dream. Thank you so much to you all for sharing your vision and your perspective on where we're at right now. And charging us at the Critical Path Institute with coming up with mechanisms to try and facilitate that collaboration. So you've given me some homework, so thanks for that. And I look forward to your point, Christine, and coming back and talking about this all again in maybe a year or two's time to see how right or wrong we were.
Absolutely.
That's fantastic. So again, thank you so much, Elena, Christine, and Mark for joining me at this eCOA conversation.
Did you enjoy this episode? Share it with a friend or colleague, or leave a review on iTunes, and help others discover and support our mission. We are welcoming guests with a range of experiences and viewpoints. The views expressed belong to the guests themselves. Learn more about Critical Path Institute at cpath.org.
That's c-path.org.
Stay tuned for our next episode coming soon, and thanks for listening.